But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
You're listening to the History in Motion podcast, where history comes alive through the eyes of the people who lived it. In each episode, we follow one life, one set of choices, and the world those choices helped shape. Few artists have captured emotion like Vincent van Gogh, a man of faith, despair, and relentless creativity, painting not for fame, but to make sense of his world. In this episode, we explore the life behind the Starry Night, poverty, the passion, and the painful brilliance that define one of history's most misunderstood geniuses.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we are continuing down our lives of artists and specifically looking at Vincent van Gogh today. And it's a little different, I would say, than last time. We talked about Michelangelo and all the great things that he did. A little bit of a different tone today with Vincent van Gogh. And if anything about him and his life, you already know kind of where this is going. And yeah, it's going to be, I think, kind of another tragic figure in some respects here, but another person whose impact on the modern world in a different way is definitely up there with some of the top artists that we've studied, at least so far.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Paul. Definitely a tragic figure. And we'll see as we go through his biography and some of the context. He did lead a somewhat somber, sad life. And I think as I was going through his biography, that kind of theme really just sticks with it. I think in many respects, he is an artistic genius, but he was very troubled. And I think as we go through his story, the issues that he dealt with through his own mental health, his ability to kind of ground himself in his work, in some ways did give him brief kind of points of his life where he was extremely focused and productive, but they were often kind of coupled with moments of very sad, tragic, like mental health chapters where he was seemingly falling apart while exploring all these creative outlets.
Yeah, and when we look at comparing and contrasting with Michelangelo and the type of works that he was doing, this is about the glory of God or showing a biblical story or really focusing on this religious element. Now, obviously, his backers are the ones that want these sort of things, but this is also the time period that they're in. We don't see a lot of Michelangelo's personal feelings coming through in his art. Maybe you see a little bit of it, but it's really focused on that element of the religious stories that he's trying to tell. In this era, Van Gogh really creates this tortured genius, if you will, this artist who's showing the tragedy of their life through their art and expressing it in that way. And I think when we think about artists today, whether you can go in a bunch of different directions, but there is definitely a subset of the art world where you would say, hey, this is a way to express trauma, express pain, and get it out. And sometimes beautiful things can come out of that. But I wouldn't say it starts with Van Gogh, but I think it definitely gets popularized in the mainstream because of his story and his work. And we'll see as we go through, there's lots of parts to this that kind of create this legendary figure, all kind of rustled around this really just tragic, tortured, broken figure who's just trying to express himself through his art.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think this trope of the sad artist definitely comes to mind as I was going through his bio. And then this theme of the line between genius and madness is a very fine one. And I think we'll definitely get into that. But without further ado, we'll jump into his bio. So Vincent Willem van Gogh was born in 1853 in the Netherlands. He was the eldest surviving child of his father, Theodorus, who was a Protestant minister, and his mother, Anna. Growing up, he grew up with 3 sisters and 2 brothers, including Theo, who was born in 1857. So we'll talk a little bit more about him as we go throughout his story, because he plays a pretty pivotal role in Van Gogh's life. When he was growing up, he was often kind of characterized as a very quiet, serious boy who would find solace in nature. And it's documented that his family would often take walks in the countryside. And I think we're already kind of seeing some of his love of the natural world arise at such an early age. And at age 11, he's actually sent to a boarding school, and he was miserable there. And later to a secondary school, which he also left abruptly in 1868. And he never actually returned to formal studies after that. And most of his teachers and a lot of his kind of compatriots at the time really viewed him as very introverted, prone to melancholy, even in youth. And he At this time, he actually showed like little to no sign of any artistic talent in these early years. At 16, this is where he takes his first step into the art world through family connections. So his uncle is an art dealer, and he was able to secure him an apprenticeship at an international art dealership in The Hague. Vincent proved pretty competent in 1873 within this kind of internship, and he was transferred to the London branch of this dealership. Living in London, it obviously exposed him to culture and art. He visited the British Museum and National Gallery, and he kind of admired these realist paintings of peasant life by artists like Millet and Breton. But his time as a dealer was troubled. At this time, he grew increasingly isolated and intensely religious. By 1875, he's still working at for the art dealership, but he's spending a lot more time quoting the Bible, and he's spending much more time attending to church than selling art. So, his employers are pretty dismayed by this very odd behavior and this kind of faltering performance. So he actually is dismissed in 1876. And here we enter a chapter of his life where he kind of spends several years just wandering. He tried and failed to find his calling. He taught for a time at a boarding school in England. He served as a lay preacher, but again, his prospects were very dim. And his family, kind of sensing that he was interested in theology, tried to urge him to actually study it, but he lacked the discipline for university studies, and he abandoned the attempt a year after in Amsterdam. But he was still determined to lead a life of service. So he actually headed to a coal mining region in Belgium as a lay missionary. There he kind of lived in squalor, more or less, in this very impoverished situation with these destitute miners. He would sleep on the floor. He gave away his possessions. He would tend to the sick. He had a kind of zealous compassion, and it earned him the nickname at the time, the Christ of the coal mine. But this kind of radical self-denial alarmed a lot of his church superiors, and his preaching contract was not renewed in 1880.
Lots of ups and downs. And I think it's funny when you hear how his family gets involved. They're like, just do something, please. If you want to be a preacher, go do that. If you want to sell art, do that. But this floating around and not really having much structure in your life is not really going to fly. But yeah, you can see the challenges here, right? And I think again, I'm trying not to pull the inevitability tropes here of like, oh my God, you just look at how he couldn't find his life, and there's so much, you can see the pain being built up inside him. But a lot of it, I think, is what a lot of people go through, especially at this time when the world is changing so quickly, the 1800s or late 1800s. Yeah, it's a tricky one, because you really just have to take this, I think, on the surface of he doesn't know what he wants to do. He's finding God. He's not really finding anything from a career standpoint, and he's kind of just going through the flow, but he's kind of taking it to that extra level where you're like, all right, you can do all the things that you need to do, but please take care of yourself. And I think you're starting to see that from just how any family would look at someone in their family who's kind of in that state of just do what you want to do, but just, look after yourself.
Yeah. And I think on the flip side of that coin, right, I think we're already getting a sense of he's trying, it's not for a lack of effort that he's failing. He's looking for a calling. He's trying to find something that he can, kind of center around his life as whatever service he decides to do or whatever his calling is. But there's obviously a sense that he's going to do it his way. He's not willing to go to school or do the studies or, get the formal education around it. It's very much his approach to doing things his way. But essentially, at this point in his life, there are, countless setbacks that kind of plunge him into despair. And at 27, he returns back home. At this point, more or less, his family does consider himself a failure. And he probably sees himself in a similar way. Yet out of this low point kind of came a critical turning point. Art in itself became his salvation. So Vincent, throughout this preceding period, had long sketched little scenes and letters to his brother Theo. And Theo now encouraged him to pursue art more seriously. So one of the things that you'll notice throughout this episode is that as we get deeper into his life, we refer to his brother Theo a lot. And thankfully, because of just, good archival practices, there are hundreds of letters between him and Theo. So it really does, one, give us a glimpse into the very tight relationship that they had, but also provides a purview into, the mind and workings of Van Gogh at the time. So in the late 1880s, Vincent took Theo's advice to heart. So he decided he's going to become an artist, a vocation through which he believed he could still serve a higher purpose. So he moves to Brussels to begin formal training in drawing and anatomy, and he's essentially subsisting on money that Theo, who's now an art dealer in Paris, would send regularly. And this is a theme that will continue out through the rest of his life. Again, it's a bold decision. He had no formal art background, and he was essentially self-taught, but it would change his life and art history forever. And the support of his loyal brother Theo, which continued unwaveringly throughout all of the ups and downs that would find Vincent throughout his life, would provide the financial and emotional lifeline for his new artistic career.
Yeah, he's really got someone in his corner, thankfully, in this situation who's, going to support him in what he needs to do. And thankfully for that, because I think it's almost clear that I think his mental state and just kind of the person that he is, being self-sufficient is going to be very, very difficult. And yeah, he needs someone who can kind of just give him that little bit of a jump start to pursue things, and a little bit of encouragement, but also to have someone in your corner as well, I think is really important. And also to just kind of getting into his art career, or art kind of styling here. At this point, to moving to Paris, and we'll get into this in a little bit as we get into his works, but this isn't, I would say, in the art scene at this time. It is very regionally based. It isn't just like Western European Impressionism or Post-Impressionism and all of these different styles. There really is more of like a Dutch style and a French style. The Dutch being a little bit more, really when it comes to color, kind of more earthy colors, where the French are being much more lively, I would say. Brighter colors, being a bit more uppity, if you will, with their work. And by Vincent kind of moving into these different areas and kind of being exposed to different types of art, we'll start to see in his art how this changes a little bit, where he'll start out very much in the traditional Dutch style, but you'll start to see these other influences come in. And I think that's what's super interesting about this time period, is it's much easier for these different styles to be shared around. And it's not coming from, like we saw with Michelangelo, it's not all coming from church backers for the most part, or religious elements. It's people just painting stuff, people just doing stuff. And the cost of entry is much lower now. You don't need a huge commission to do these types of works. So we'll start to see a little bit of that as we go through, but just something to keep in mind, kind of he's moving around for the listeners to think about, is the little bits of styles that he's going to start picking up and the different changes that he's going to be seeing. Because like I said, it's much more accessible now. More people are doing art, and these different little styles are going to start poking up in a more regional sense than just, hey, this is how art is at this time, and everybody kind of does the same thing.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And I think you're going to see this organic evolution of how his style changes from, what we're about to talk to, which is his years spend, the Dutch years, quote unquote, where he kind of becomes the peasant painter, to when he moves into Paris and is amidst a much different art scene, more or less. So at this point in time, it's kind of around the 1881 to 1885. This is where he kind of, really enters the art world as a novice. His first 3 years are kind of spent with intense practice and personal struggle in various parts of the Netherlands. So in 1881, he returns back to his parents' house, and he throws himself into learning to draw and paint. He focuses a lot on nature, outdoors, and he would actually copy prints to hone his skills. His parents, they're pretty conservative, and they're pretty dismayed by this what they would deem an impractical calling, which they kind of saw as a social failure in some regards. And tensions because of this at home would worsen, and Vincent would eventually leave home because there were some other, issues that were going on. He actually fell desperately in love with his recently widowed cousin. She rejected his advances unequivocally, and Vincent's refusal to accept her, advances kind of estranged him from the family. And this led to a very heated argument on Christmas Day, 1881, where he effectively left home abruptly. He packed his bags, walked out, and this is where he throws himself at his artwork completely. In 1882, he settles into The Hague, and this is a new chapter of his artistic development. So he seeks guidance from his cousin-in-law, who is a respected school painter at the Hague School, who agreed to mentor him. So under his tutelage, Vincent practiced very basic techniques. He learned to work in watercolor and oil, and he visited a studio almost daily to keep these lessons going. Quote unquote, as he wrote to Theo in one of his letters, "I feel my power of painting grows." An uncle actually commissioned a series of cityscape drawings from Vincent, which helped him develop his draftsmanship and perspective skills. Yet even though he progressed in art, his personal life always kind of remained turbulent. So in 1888, he befriended a prostitute, a pregnant prostitute at that, and he took her along with her young daughter and newborn baby into his home. Her name was Cian, and she became a model and a companion for a lot of his artwork, and he genuinely tried to create a family with her out of compassion. And this is a very unconventional arrangement that was not viewed very well by any of his relatives, those helping him with his artwork or his like father or mother. And about a year and a half later, this relationship ends. You know, her alcoholism and instability were overwhelming, and Vincent wrote with despair that she has too far gone to find her own feet, despite, you know, his hopes to help. So after this, in the autumn of 1883, he returns to the remote countryside of Drenthe in the northern regions of the Netherlands. And this is kind of a pattern that you'll see. You'll have these bouts of like artistic production. Something will kind of go wrong in his social or personal life, and then he'll retreat into nature to find some solace. And this is kind of a pattern that we'll see throughout. Here, he's able to create these very melancholy drawings and paintings of boggy plains, this very Dutch style of painting, Paul, that you were alluding to. And by 1884, 1885, this is where he kind of becomes known as the peasant painter that he'd aspire to be. This rural setting was very ideal for his mission to paint the life of the common people. You know, he'd sketch and painted local farmers, laborers, weavers, and he was determined to show their dignity in hardship. And this is where he paints one of his earliest well-known paintings, and it sadly is right after his father dies in 1885 of a stroke. He was actually very close to his father, even though they were kind of distant just because of how Van Gogh was choosing to lead his life at this point. So almost immediately after the funeral, he moves out of the family house again, and he immerses himself in executing a very grand project that he'd been planning, and it's called the Potato Eaters. And I think this is actually like a perfect case study in the Dutch style of painting, Paul, that you were alluding to. And it's a very ambitious masterpiece. It's a dark tone group scene of a peasant family sharing a meager meal of potatoes by lamplight. And after kind of nearly 2 years of relentless practice, he felt the time had come to prove himself with this very complex, multi-figure composition. He deliberately chose a very coarse, authentic theme, humble workers eating their daily meal, a subject that he noted was popular amongst Dutch realist artists at the time.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating one. And you're right about, like, I just have what I have written down here is like the style of it. Murky, dark tones, brown, olive green, black. And it's really exactly what you mentioned, this difficult life. And even Van Gogh has said that he painted some of the faces of the peasants the colors of a really dusty, unpeeled potato. So you get that, like, yeah, this is a tough life that these people are living, and I'm going to capture this, and I'm going to capture it through my art. And again, I don't think it's too far to say that, yeah, he's probably had some difficult times in life. Like you mentioned, his father passing away and all the other things that are happening in his life. And so he's probably gone out and he's looking for something that kind of captures his emotion, but he's doing it through kind of this scene of these peasants. And I think it's worth stopping here to just kind of go over a little bit of this Impressionism and Post-Impressionism type of art. And we'll go over it just briefly because you can go really deep into some of this stuff. But really what we're seeing here is Van Gogh working in the Post-Impressionism period. So to become Post-Impressionism, you may be wondering, well, what is Impressionism? And that's kind of what comes before, typically starting in France, 1860s to late 1880s. A famous artist in this era would have been Monet. And really, this is the changing of using like unmixed colors, very loose brushwork, very bright colors as well, to give this kind of make something that looks nice, if you will. Like, it's my very simplistic way of looking at it. They're trying to do this over really precise detail. That's kind of the change that's happened here. Let's use some different techniques to create something beautiful and to create something that portrays kind of these more naturey, lighter type of themes without having to get into like the super realistic. And when we see Van Gogh's work, you'll look at it and go, yeah, that's not super realistic, but it's interesting. You look at Starry Night, for example, and it's obviously not exactly what the night looked like, but there's more going on there, and it's got its own beauty in its own way. But what this Post-Impressionism era kind of looks at is it continues this use of vivid colors and light and real life subject matter, but it rejects the naturalism elements. So Impressionism is really a lot around the nature piece of this, where we see Van Gogh and some of these other artists really go for their own personal expression in deeper symbolism, if it's geometric forms or different color palettes, but there's an emotion there. I think that's the big difference. Not to say that Impressionism has no emotion, it has plenty of emotion, but it's less, I would say, of trying to express what's happening inward by showing something. And I think it all comes back to the Potato Eaters here for Van Gogh. We look at him portraying, using this kind of impressionist style with this darker kind of somber tone, but it is coming from within to an extent here. And again, I don't want to say Impressionism isn't just, there's nothing coming from within, they're just painting what they see. But it is just a little bit of an evolution and a transformation that's going a little bit more into, you can see more, I guess, into the artist's thoughts and feelings at the time they painted it than you would maybe a more traditional Impressionist painting. And that's what I think we see very clearly here with this first painting.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. There's a quote here that I have that I think will kind of bring that together really well. So once he kind of captured this rustic reality, he's quoted as saying, he wanted to capture people who have tilled the earth with the very hands they are putting in the dish of potatoes. So he's obviously very excited about his work and the authenticity he's able to kind of capture within this painting. However, the reception within this small circle of painters that he shared it with, including his brother Theo and his artist friends, critique the potato eaters for its rough technique and anatomical awkwardness. And if you do Google it, you can say that is probably a pretty fair criticism because they are kind of awkward looking. But again, it's the sense of what he's trying to capture with their sunken faces and the dark tones of who the potato eaters are. But again, it ultimately failed to launch his career as he had hoped. From here, he actually ends up leaving to head towards Antwerp to take additional classes at an art academy to expose himself to a wider art scene. And he is able to do this because Antwerp's art scene is a bit more bustling at the time. There's a lot of museums. There's more, I guess, multicultural exchanges with Japanese prints, which he seemed to really have this kind of magnetism towards because of how they would, their use of color. But in the same vein, his health deteriorated pretty quickly in Antwerp. He was impoverished, undernourished, and he began to suffer from what was likely a form of syphilis or some similar illness. He was losing his teeth and energy. And by 1886, he realizes he needs help and he needs to change the scenery. He abruptly leaves Antwerp and he heads to the art capital of the world, Paris. And without warning, Vincent shows up at Theo's Paris apartment in February 1886, effectively inviting himself to stay. And there's a quote from one of the letters that he shares with Theo to kind of communicate that he's coming. "Don't be cross with me that I've come all of a sudden. I think we will save time this way." He wrote in a hasty note delivered upon his arrival. So with that unannounced move, Van Gogh enters one of the most transformative phases of his career by moving to Paris.
Yeah, Theo must be some sort of brother. Like, to send him money to support him, and then you get the knock at the door of, "Hey, can I stay here for a bit?" After, and I'm sure he's not showing up he's not looking his best, I think, just based on his time in Antwerp and probably not taking care of himself once again. But this is the life of Vincent van Gogh, right? There's like a drifter element to this as well, like couch surfing, if you will. And yeah, I just got to say good on Theo, because you have to really love your brother, I feel, to be able to kind of continue to support him and kind of deal with some of these things. But at the end of the day, Theo sees his talents. He loves him as a brother. And I think that's one great thing to take away from this whole exchange. But yeah, now he's in Paris, which I think is super interesting because, like we said off the top, there is a different style happening here in Paris. And now I think we're going to start to see that piece that I teased off the top of how some of those French influences are going to really start merging into those Dutch influences and create something a little bit more unique with the way Van Gogh's going to paint.
Yeah, to your first point, I think Theo is very much an unsung hero of this story, broadly speaking. But so at this point, Van Gogh arrives in Paris. He's there for about 2 years, from 1886 to early 1888. And this is where his kind of artistic evolution takes a very dramatic turn. So he arrives as a painter of these like dark country peasants and left with the foundations of the kind of Parisian, bold, colorful style that would later make him famous. So Paris in the late 1880s was the pulsating center of the art avant-garde movement. So Paul, like you had mentioned, Impressionism had broken the old rules of academic art. You have these new movements kind of vying to push them further. And then again, thanks to Theo's connections, because he was an art dealer in modern paintings, Vincent was introduced to like some cutting edge ideas and artists almost immediately. And Theo would show him works of other great Impressionists like Monet, who would demonstrate to Van Gogh how light and color could be captured in this kind of broken, high key tone fashion. And Vincent also enrolled briefly in classes at a studio where he would befriend other young artists who would become pretty influential, like Bernard, Paul Signac. So this atmosphere was pretty electric. There's all these new impressions and people who had an influence on his own work and inspired him to experiment freely. And these are direct notes from the Van Gogh Museum. So indeed, he quickly shed kind of that mud brown palette of his Dutch years and began painting with much brighter, richer colors, a shift famously evident when you compare The Potato Eaters, which was created in 1885, to a work like The Hill of Montmartre with Stone Quarry in 1886, which has bursts of like light greens and yellows.
Yeah, we even see him transition into all of the sunflower era of Van Gogh, right? Mm-hmm. Of going from, like, if you look at The Potato Eaters, it can't get really much more gritty and dark and just rough than that, to, hey, sunflowers. It's a nice day. The sun's out. The sunflowers are out. And he kind of jokes that this is going to be my flower, right? I'm going to be the sunflower guy, which I think, again, just goes to show the ups and downs of this guy's life. When things are good, I'm going to paint some sunflowers. When things are bad, I'm going to paint really dark, somber tones. And I'm sure some of those French influences are coming in and those sort of things, but I just do find it is a bit of an interesting transition with him as we can follow kind of his life through the brightness, if you will, of some of his art versus the dark grittiness, at least at this stage, in his career.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think in Paris, if we're trying to sum it up in a poignant way, his art kind of moves from dark to light. And it is a chapter which does influence how the rest of his paintings that he's known for today are going to take shape. But again, here's this pattern that kind of crops up again. So while Paris brings growth, it also brings him to a breaking point. So 2 years in this bustling metropolis, his nerves are pretty strained. He's a pretty sensitive and he's pretty high strung at this point, and he begins to feel overwhelmed by city life. So after 2 years, it became too much. He felt physically exhausted. He also drank absinthe to excess, and his health suffered from it. And because of that, he, creatively speaking, was probably stifled by the constant competition and chatter of the Paris art world. Again, he longs for sunshine, nature, and a fresh start away from the crowds. He's always dreamed of the south of France, which he imagined as a land of bright light and vivid colors, like the Japanese prints he really focused on from his time in Antwerp that he brought over to Paris with him. So at this point, in February 1888, he made that dream a reality. He hops on a train and heads to the provincial town of Arles, and this is his way of seeking light and color of the Japanese landscapes, quote unquote, and refuge to recharge his soul. So in some ways, Paris had given him knowledge and color. Now he sought inspiration and peace in the sunny fields of Arles.
Yeah, this Japanese style stuff's pretty interesting. He collected a lot of these prints, and really I think what he liked was, I guess the summary that I've got here is saying, it's these bold outlines, flat areas of color, and just compositions that are just different to what he's seeing in Western Europe because it's coming from so far away. And it really looks at, these flattened perspectives and really just eliminating shadows, which again, like if we're going from hyper-realistic, traditional academic painting that would have been around, and you mentioned it, Richie, on how Impressionism is kind of tearing away from that. Yeah, he's going to get rid of shadows because he's seeing it in other stuff and it looks cool. And he wants to kind of jump on that. And he talks about in his writing that he wanted the color in some of these paintings that he's going to do to have this Japanese purity and simplicity that he finds really interesting. And again, it's a really cool fusion. And being the history guys that we are, I think the most interesting part of all this is the fact that he can even get Japanese prints from so far away just tells you what part of the world we're in, where I was already kind of saying, going to go from the Netherlands to Paris. Ooh, big difference. And he's going to learn things. Well, now he's getting stuff from Japan, right? The other side of the world, which 200 years ago was unthinkable, just to kind of show how we are in this hyper-industrialized kind of time period and things are happening so fast. But I think that's just kind of the cool piece too, that some poor drifter of an artist is able to get his hands on prints from Japan and be able to incorporate that into his work, which I think is just kind of cool to just see where we are in the history of the world.
I think that's such an important point because throughout his time in Paris, he continues to refer back to those wood blocks of Japanese art that really do motivate him to take on a different interpretation and use of color in his own work. And I think we see this in 1888 where he moves to Arles. And this is one of those really crazy chapters in his life because it is like one of the most creatively productive periods, but it also ends up being his most emotionally volatile period of his life. So in the spring and summer of 1888, he works with an intensity and joy that he had rarely ever known before. He's surrounded by this beautiful landscape, orchards blooming pink and white in spring, golden wheat fields in the summer, the deep blue of the sky, all inspired him tremendously. He painted orchards bursting with blossom, fields being harvested, and he even made a trip to the Mediterranean coast to paint fishing boats at the seaside. So with this kind of rapid, loose brushwork and this very high key palette, his style became more expressive and spontaneous as ever. And during these months, he actually produced some of his masterpieces that he's well known for today, which is his Sunflower series. It's this vibrant still life of yellow sunflowers in a very simple vase created to decorate his yellow house and welcome his hope for guests. Then you have the yellow house itself, which is a very humble dwelling that he lived in, that he painted under a brilliant sky. The other one that I looked up was the Cafe Terrace at night. It kind of uses these very interesting shades of yellow to capture the glowing light of the gas lamps against a blue night, and many like portraits of local characters, which he was also known for.
Yeah, as I kind of just flip through some of these pictures, they're nice. Like, these are just nice paintings. He's out at night taking a look at a cafe, or he's kind of out by the sea and there's some boats, and it's these nice vistas. And yeah, it seems that if we're going to read anything through his art, he's just having a good time exploring, seeing different things, painting different, if it's the more sunflowers, as he will continue to do, things that he's encountering. But this is the fun part of Van Gogh, right? It's never this simple. It's just, okay, yeah, maybe he's finally found a place, he's settled, he's painting the things that he likes to do. But unfortunately with him, I don't think anything's that simple.
And I think this is where it takes a drastic, sad turn in some ways, and it's kind of ironic. So here he is in Arles, he's painting, he's creating, and I think, Paul, it's the right approach, because just from my takeaways, the way that he paints really does provide a mirror into how he's feeling, and we'll see this throughout his life. But one of the things that's kind of unique is that he really yearned for artistic camaraderie, and in one of his letters to Theo, he says, "I've always thought it ridiculous for painters to live alone. You always lose when you're isolated," which is very interesting for Van Gogh to say. So he actually persuades one of his artist friends to join him. So this is Paul Gauguin. He was a former stockbroker turned post-impressionist painter, and similar to Vincent, he actually didn't have a lot of popularity while he was alive. A lot of his works became popular posthumously, and at first they were two artists who enjoyed working together side by side. They had fruitful exchanges on ideas and portraits they made of each other, but they did have some very intense discussions about what the intention of art and style was. So beneath this very kind of collegial surface, there were some very fundamental differences and personal conflicts that brewed between the both of them. And more or less the crux of these arguments was divergent philosophies. Gauguin painted from imagination and memory. He wanted to favor symbolic and abstracted forms, whereas Van Gogh insisted on painting from nature, from reality, directly observing his subjects. And you would think that this is just a difference in opinion, that two friends who could continue to live with each other peacefully. Not in this case. So in December 1888, this situation kind of reaches a crescendo. They're quarreling fiercely. Accounts suggest one fight may have been over a petty issue or like an actual philosophical disagreement that escalated. Gauguin decided he could no longer stay in Arles, and he told Vincent he planned. The thought of his friend's departure was such an emotional breaking point for Van Gogh that one evening, in the midst of a heated desperation, he confronts him with a razor in hand, threatening to harm himself or Gauguin. We don't really know, but Paul's able to diffuse the situation by leaving the house. He takes the train that night. But at this point, after his friend's departure, Van Gogh's mind kind of just gives away. And it's assumed that he's in kind of like a state of psychosis or psychotic confusion, and he mutilates his own left ear. He cuts off the lower part of his ear, and he then, very strangely, wraps the severed ear in a paper and brings it to a prostitute at a local brothel, asking her to keep the object carefully, quote unquote. Obviously, this woman is horrified. She calls the police, and by Christmas Eve morning, Vincent was found bleeding, semi-conscious at his yellow house and was rushed to the hospital. So his friend, who had already fled to a hotel and left Arles by train, was deeply shaken, but Theo, his brother, comes. He hurries overnight from an overnight train from Paris, and he arrives on Christmas Day to find Vincent weak and delirious in the hospital. Here's a quote from him. "I found Vincent in the hospital. For the past few days, he has been showing symptoms of that most dreadful illness, madness," that Theo wrote to his wife Johanna, describing the doctor's uncertain prognosis of his own devastation.
Yeah, it's the psychotic breakdown, I'm sure, of some degree, but it's sad because you kind of teed it off by saying he's writing these letters to Theo saying, I don't like being alone as an artist. I really think we should be together. Then his buddy comes, they're having a good time, but he just, again, I guess this level of mental illness for him, it just gets to a certain point where, and I think it's part of his life, right? So many people have been rejecting him for the quirks of his life and the struggles that he's going to have socially. But now when it's getting violent and Gauguin's like, yeah, this was a good time, but I'm not messing around with this. And then he does that to himself based on losing another person in his life. And I'm sure there's a lot of self-blame of like, you've done it again to yourself. You had someone who you really enjoyed spending time with, but you couldn't keep it together. And here we are, right? This is the Van Gogh trope, if you will. Hacking off part of the ear, psychotic breakdown, but brilliance comes out of this psychosis. And if we're going to look at that trope of crazy artists who can create crazy things and beautiful things in their worst times, this is that archetype happening right before us here. But yeah, really difficult to see because especially back then, they don't really fully understand what's happening to him. But at the very least, hey, he's in a hospital getting some care, which, we'll see how his life wraps up, but may have delayed, unfortunately, the inevitable by at least getting him in the right hands at this point.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I think, his dreams of his studio in the South is pretty much in tatters at this point. So a week later after the incident, it's like early January 1889, he's discharged from the hospital, and he actually has very little recollection of the ear incident, which is apparently very common after these kind of acute psychiatric episodes. And he tries to return to painting as if nothing happens, but he creates a few self-portraits with his bandaged ear, but his mental stability remains pretty precarious. And in the months after the incident, he had several aftershocks. He would have sudden lapses of confusion and hallucination, and in all likelihood is either triggered by stress or his alcohol consumption. And at one point, his neighbors even started to consider him as dangerous, and they petitioned the authorities to have him removed for everyone's safety. And this obviously, really hit hard for Vincent and his despair. And he writes in a letter to Theo, "I have not harmed anyone. Am I truly a danger?" So he's heartbroken that the community he loved and has turned against him at this point. And this is a very critical moment in his life. And he recognizes that his illness was serious and he's fearing any further breakdowns. So he makes very, very brave decision. He decides to commit himself to an asylum. And in May 1889, with Theo's support, Van Gogh voluntarily entered the St. Paul de Massoul psychiatric hospital nearby St. Remy. And he had hoped under that medical care in a controlled environment, he might actually find a measure of stability to continue his work.
Well, it really goes to show, right? It's not all madness with him, right? There's definitely elements where when he's in a good state, he's able to make wise decisions and settle down. And I feel for the guy, right? Because he's in this hospital. He doesn't fully remember what happened with his ear and essentially threatening and almost attacking his friend. And then being told you need to leave because you're violent. It really is just like it's tricky for him, and it's hard because I don't think he fully can understand what that other side of him becomes. And when he's in his normal state, if you will, his happy state, he can't figure that out. And I think that letter, I think, is the most heartbreaking thing to me, is just he doesn't get it. And he probably never will, just based on the state that he's in. He doesn't understand that there's a very violent and dark person in there that he doesn't fully understand. But it does seem here that he knows that there's something going on that he needs to get help with. And yeah, it's a very brave move for him, especially at this time where going into an asylum it's not a country club, and we'll see how this period changes his life. But yeah, it's just, again, the tragic figure is continuing to grow here, and you feel for the guy, really.
Yeah. And I think there's what might seem as a redemption arc at this point for his livelihood. So he in totality, he spends 12 months, so pretty much a full year in the asylum. And it's kind of tucked away in the hills of St. Remy. And it's kind of cloistered amongst these lavender fields and stone walls, where he is really going to battle his inner demons while also producing some of his most famous and visionary masterpieces. Now, when he arrives at St. Remy, he's obviously feeling defeated, but he's made a resolute decision. And the asylum director, a doctor, comments on kind of his position when Vincent walks in. And he notes that Mr. Vincent was perfectly calm and explained his illness. And the doctor kind of diagnoses Vincent's condition as a form of epilepsy accompanied by acute insanity and hallucinations. And he kind of blames Vincent's own accounts of his attacks on his, overt drinking and reliance on alcoholism and stress levels as to why this is happening. In modern hindsight, there have been multiple theories: bipolar disorder, temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, all exacerbated by his stress and alcohol consumption. But really, there is no consensus on what his exact illness was. But more or less, his life falls into a very steady rhythm here that initially has a very calming effect. Luckily enough for him, the asylum was only half full. So Vincent had a private room and even a second room to use as a painting studio. And it allowed him to paint, and he was actually allowed to paint and stroll the grounds when he felt well. In letters to his brother, he describes the institution's walled gardens and almond trees and blossom vines, ivy and pines visible from his window. So there's a sense of kind of controlled solitude that's safer than Arles that helped him regain his confidence. And Vincent wrote to Theo with a mix of like dark honesty and hope. And in one remarkably candid letter, which is dated May 1889, he confessed the depths of his despair following the incident that had happened. Quote unquote, "The shock was such that it disgusted me even to move. Nothing would have been so agreeable to me as never to wake up again," he admitted. But he noted that this horror of life had gradually lessened, though he still felt no will at times. He observed the other patients and found solace in realizing that he was not alone in his struggles. Again, he writes to Theo, "I observe in others that they have too heard sounds and strange voices, and that softens the horror. Had I not seen other mad people up close, I wouldn't have been able to stop thinking about it all the time."
And it might be the first time for him that he really fully understands that he's not the only person in the world that's like this. And this is a much more human thing. And he's saying that in that writing there. But I think that's a nice little thing for him to at least understand. But you can still see in those writings, there's a dark element here that is still happening and he's still trying to wrestle with. And yeah, thankfully he's in this kind of confined, or not confined, but there's some walls physically and mentally put around kind of his state, and it seems to be helping with some stability. And there's just some really good introspection we're seeing there. But again, that darkness is still there. And yeah, he's not going to be able to beat it long term, but at least in the short term, he's going to be able to at least do what he loves and paint and try to just kind of live day by day, it seems.
And that's pretty much what he does in so many ways, right? Art really does become his medicine and his remedy and his lifeline. And he is able to produce some of his most renowned work. So in June 1889, he paints Starry Night, which is the depiction of the sky itself. It's this very intensely turbulent, agitated night sky. And that's the one that I, was most familiar with before we jumped into this episode. He also paints his other iconic works, Irises, which is a vibrant study of violet flowers. And then he actually paints The Bedroom, which is painting from memory of his room in Arles, which is, kind of a reminder of his happier times. So again, he is able to, at some point, I think he's averaging like a full canvas every couple days while he's at the asylum. So for several months, this structured life is pretty stable. It's extremely productive, but it takes a turn. However, in like the late summer, autumn of that year, he suffered a severe relapse. And in mid-July 1889, while painting outdoors, he's overtaken by hallucination and this kind of catastrophic anxiety. And this is obviously the telltale signs of another breakdown. So after this episode, and with several more kind of bouts of illness followed in the second half of 1899, some lasting weeks, during these attacks, he was pretty much incapacitated. He later had no memory of the things he said or did, and at times he was put in a padded cell for his own safety. Again, another line from a letter post these events that he shares with Theo. "For many days I've been absolutely distraught. It's to be presumed these crises will reoccur. It is abominable," he wrote in anguish. And he found himself after each recovering at this point being more anxious about the future. And yet, whenever he emerged from attack, his first impulse was always to paint again, as if to kind of reaffirm his existence and sanity through creating something. And by the start of 1890, he makes another resolute decision. He decides to leave the asylum. He had grown weary of confinement and kind of longed for normalcy, and he was craving a bit of freedom. So doctors had agreed that since he had improved, a lot given his attempt to return to society, and if he was provided support, he would be okay. So in May 1890, after a full year at Saint-Remy, he bids farewell to the institution and returns to Auvoir, which is just outside Paris, to be closer to Theo and place himself just under the care of a homeopathic physician who was also an art enthusiast. And this is where we see one of the most interesting chapters of his life.
Yeah, there's not much time left in his life, but it's interesting. He comes out, right? And this is where we start to see some notoriety for him. prefaced and said, like, nobody knew who this guy was outside of maybe a niche art scene. But now we're starting to get, art reviewers looking at his work and his exhibitions that he's been putting on and saying some things around, okay, this guy's got some talent. This guy's pretty skilled. And we even get Claude Monet saying there was an exhibition in Paris and Claude Monet says he thought Van Gogh's work was the best. So I'm looking at all of this. Okay, the doctor say, come on out of the asylum. I think you've progressed enough. He's getting some notoriety from his fellow artists, which is great. This should be really a turning point, you would think, in his life. And I think, Richie, when you said interesting, I think that's probably the only way you could describe this is just interesting, because I just teed up. Things should be going pretty well with him now. He's starting to get that notoriety. Things are going better. He's closer to his brother, but it's never simple with Van Gogh, as I've mentioned many times throughout this conversation.
So this is the kind of the last stage of his life, more or less. We're talking spring, summer 1890. So he arrives in Havre in May of 1890 with a very cautious optimism. The region does provide the peace and quiet he needed, while he's still close enough to Paris for comfort and close to Theo, who's now married and is a new father, who's only a short train ride away, and Dr. Gachet, whom Theo had arranged to look after Vincent, which apparently he was kind of an eccentric physician by most accounts, but he was an amateur painter himself, and he immediately bonded with Van Gogh, and he encouraged Vincent to pour himself into, art as much as possible, saying that it was the best medicine that he could have. And Vincent did just that. And this is probably, I didn't know this about him, so I don't know if our listeners will, but there is a burst of creativity that he's able to achieve here in his final weeks, which is nothing short of miraculous. It's almost as if he sensed that his time was short. He painted constantly, roaming the fields, thatched villages with a canvas and an easel. He threw himself into his paintings. He pretty much completed a work a day in this period. In less than 70 days, he produced 75 paintings, which is an output that is so crazy that some residents would see him working furiously in the wheat fields even under a summer rain. His subjects were the wheat fields, reapers, blooming gardens, twisted oaks, the architecture of the town, and even expressive portraits like the portrait of Dr. Gachet. And in that portrait, you can see Van Gogh depicts his doctor with this kind of melancholy air, a foxglove plant on the table, which is kind of a symbol of his medicinal trade, conveying this kind of soulful empathy between him and patient.
Yeah, it's a super interesting time. And like you said, Richie, many times, we can tell the story of Van Gogh a little bit through his art, and you see a little bit of everything. But there's this one painting that's called Souring Old Man, and then it's also been kind of noted as At Eternity's Gate. And it's just this old man sitting in a chair, face in his hands, and just looks really painful and just really sad and just dealing with something really deep. And so you see those sort of things pop up as well, where he's doing what he usually does from a nature perspective, but sometimes you see paintings like that and you go, oh boy, there's might be whatever that darkness is, it's still sitting within him. And I think, to your point, Richie, I think knowing that the end is coming, I think is probably exactly what he's thinking, or he knows that that next breakdown that happens could be his last. And to hold off that from coming, if I just dive into this art and just keep going and don't let the personal issues that always seem to come up, I'm going to be able to maybe get through some of these things. And maybe it wasn't so much that, the inevitable is coming, so I should paint as much as I can so I can get as much artwork done before I die. I think it may have been also, I think it's probably more of that, just a defense mechanism at this point. And I'm sure that that's doctor's orders too, right? Go paint. That's exactly what he's doing.
And there's a very kind of sad subtext to this, right? So you could imagine someone who's this productive might be feeling pretty calm and restored and secure in their position. But under this calm is a growing current of anxiety. And it's related to Vincent's insecurities about burdening Theo. So this entire time we've been talking about Theo kind of always willing to help and show up for his brother Vincent. So in early July 1890, Van Gogh actually goes to Paris to visit Theo, his wife Jo, and their infant son, who's actually named Vincent after his uncle. During that visit, Vincent learns that Theo's actually pretty frustrated with his current employer, and he's considering leaving the firm to start his own business. And this, for some reason, deeply unsettles Vincent. He immediately worries that Theo's finances the very lifeline for Vincent's own modest living would become precarious. And he starts to feel like he's a burden on Theo. He kind of senses a storm moving. And Theo and Joe try to kind of reassure Vincent in their letters that they're not in dire straits. The books are good. He doesn't have to worry. But Vincent couldn't shake this kind of profound sense of guilt and fear about the future. And on July 10th, or in and around there, he wrote to Theo and he painted 3 large canvases of the wheat fields under stormy skies. And explicitly he says, quote unquote, "I have tried to express sadness and extreme loneliness in them." And he adds poignantly, "I hope you will see them soon. They will tell you what I can't say in words." And I think this is a bit of a hint where the art is speaking for him and it's speaking unspeakable feelings in this very prophetic, heartbreaking way. And sadly, on July 27th, 1890, after painting in a wheat field, Vincent shoots himself in the chest with a small revolver. Mortally wounded, he manages to stagger back to an inn where the innkeepers find him. He's curled up in bed, blood on his chest, and reportedly he says, "I shot myself. I only hope I haven't botched it." Doctors couldn't remove the bullet, which had missed his heart but lodged in his torso. Theo rushes from Paris to go find his brother in his final hours. According to Theo, Vincent's last words were, "This sadness will last forever." Reflecting that depth of despair, he dies from his injury just, I think, a couple of weeks later on July 29th, with his devoted brother holding his hand. He was 37 years old. The next day, Theo and a few friends buried Vincent in the Auvers town cemetery, and his coffin was covered in sunflowers. In Theo's brief eulogy, he spoke of Vincent's zeal for art and his greatness as an artist and as a man. And then sadly, Theo, who's grief-stricken and ill, he was probably suffering from syphilis, died 6 months later, and they were actually buried beside each other. And in totality, Vincent didn't really get the fame. I think he started to get a little bit of it near the end of his life, but most of his work was appreciated more so posthumously. But just to get a sense of the work that he left behind, over 850 paintings and almost 1,300 works on paper created in a mere decade.
Yeah, his death hurts, I think, a little bit when you just, it's coming. We know how this story ends, but I think it was a more I think emotional journey for me as we kind of went through it with him. Just seeing that struggle of, I'm getting there. I've almost figured this thing out. Okay, I'm making some progress, but he knows that he's going to relapse. The fact that I think he's realized what he is, even though he's not alone in this, but this is just what's going to happen. Yeah, he just tries to find these other avenues and creates, like, he's a machine by the end. Like you mentioned, those numbers are insane for any artist, let alone someone who dies at, 37, 38? Like, he's still quite young. So it's tough. And then to see Theo die like 6 months later, he's the one who's doing well with everything, the biggest supporter, but died of a broken heart, I'm sure, is one element of all of that. But yeah, no, it's tricky. But I think the great thing about the Van Goghs themselves and kind of being around him is Theo's wife, Joanna. She's the one that spearheads this kind of Van Gogh legacy. She realizes Vincent, well, she's probably always realized Vincent's work, and I'm sure Theo has always recognized his talent. And she's the one that creates this mission of, let's get his work out to the masses. Let people see the work that Vincent has done. One of the things she did was a retrospective in Amsterdam where she had 480 pieces of his works, which was the largest ever Van Gogh exhibit at the time. And it just really starts to grow, and the myth and the legend of Vincent van Gogh starts to grow around it. And by the time Joe dies in 1925, this is Joanna, everyone kind of called her Joe. In 1925, Van Gogh's a world famous artist in just kind of that short period of time, because I think his work speaks for himself, but I think the story around him, and I think why we're talking about him today, is people want to hear the story of Van Gogh, I think, more than necessarily the paintings. And you can see that in his paintings. You can read his life through his art, and I think that's very unique for a lot of other artists, at least that we've talked about. You can't really read Michelangelo's life or Da Vinci's life through their art and know what's happening in their life, but with Van Gogh, you definitely can.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think that's a great way to summarize just kind of the takeaways of this episode. I think what really hits home for me is that all those works, paintings, and 1,300 works on paper in less than a decade, and none of them at that point were known to the public or valued by collectors. So I think the part that really is kind of heartbreaking, that gives me that sinking feeling, is that here's someone who threw himself at his craft, and he could in all likelihood have died believing himself a failure. This kind of genius whose work was never accepted by the world. And I think that was the part that really kind of, cast a shadow over the research.
Yeah, and I'd be very curious. It would have been just if he could live a little bit longer and you could have seen how he handled all of that fame. It would have been a very interesting, you hope it helped him, but you never know with Vincent. And you always got to think too, you see these situations where Van Gogh's in a hospital and he paints a portrait of a doctor and he gives the portrait to someone and goes, here you go, I made you a drawing. All right, thanks, Vincent. I'll put this in my basement. And then 20 years later, oh, well, I'm now obscenely rich because he made a little small painting of me. Is kind of the craziness, I think, of this whole story too, of just, nobody even knew he was going to become this big. And you could be one of the very lucky ones who has some small little painting of his and you're a multimillionaire.
Otherwise, great episode. I think it was a sad but enjoyable journey to learn about one of the most impactful artists of this era.
Yeah, it's a tough one to wrap up, and because I think you get really close to him in this story, because this is one of those episodes, I think, where we didn't have there's no politics here. There's no imperial dynasties that we need to deal with or foreign armies coming in. It's just a guy going through his life. So I think this was fun because we got, I think, a little bit closer to the person than we usually do. And I think he was a good one to do that with, because I think there's a lot of depth to him as a person, but there's also that level of genius, which I think is the really other cool part. So really great episode. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode, and we'll see you all then.
Until next time. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening to this episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, follow and leave a review. It helps others discover the stories that shaped our world.